Welcome to another in the series of guest lectures here at the School of International Studies. My name's Louisa Parks. You may not have met me before because I don't teach that much on first year modules at the moment, but I am a professor here at the school, and I will be chairing today's lecture, which is another of our GreenDeal-NET lectures. So part of a series of lectures that we hold also within a Jean Monnet research network on environmental issues in the European Union, which the school is part of, along with a number of other European universities. So today's lecture is with the phenomenal friend of the School of International Studies that is Dr. Elsa Tsioumani. Elsa is an international environmental lawyer with 25 years of experience in intergovernmental negotiations. So she's been following various treaty bodies, most particularly the Convention on Biological Diversity since its very beginnings in the early 1990s. She's a writer for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, and she's also a very experienced consultant for various bodies, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. At the moment, she's a research fellow at the University of Liège School of Law, as well as Thessaloniki Transdisciplinary Institute for Environmental and Social Studies. And she focuses on environmental law and policies related to biodiversity, agriculture, and today's lecture's theme, emerging technologies. So one of her more recent appointments was also here in the school, where she completed a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Research Fellowship. And today's lecture is also based on the findings of the project that she carried out here with us on synthetic biology governance. And she also has an excellent book out, which is in open access. So that's one you can download for free from the internet without even being vaguely on the borders of legality. And that's called Fair and Equitable Benefit Sharing in Agriculture, Reinventing Agrarian Justice. So we're really pleased to have Elsa back with us here today. And I will give you the floor, Elsa, to talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. Let's give her a round of applause to welcome.
Thank you very much, Louisa. It's such a pleasure to be back to the School of International Studies, and thank you very much for an invitation. It's really an honor. I'm going to present some of the results of my Marie Curie research. Yes. So what I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to present some of the basics on what we mean when we talk about biodiversity, how it is connected to biotechnology and bio-based innovation in general, and how all of this is connected to risk governance, focused on the Convention on Biological Diversity and its protocols, but examining them in the broader law and policy context. And then I'm going to discuss how this policy context is being challenged by more recent technological developments in the field. And as Louisa mentioned already, this is I addressed all these issues partly as part of my Marie Curie fellowship here at the school, in the SIN BioGov project on fair and responsible governance of synthetic biology. And I'm continuing this research in my new affiliation in the University of Liège as part of an ERC project on decolonizing international biodiversity law with focus on digital sequence information. So what is biological diversity? I mean, there is the usual misconception that when we talk about biodiversity, we mean species. Well, it's much more than species. It's also ecosystems, and it's all the variety of life on the planet. Importantly for this presentation, it's also diversity at the genetic level, what at the policy fora we refer to as genetic resources. And what is also of interest for this presentation is that biological diversity, the term also extends to the combinations and interactions between all these elements. And you've probably heard that biodiversity is being lost at an alarming rate. And this has been substantiated in a series of major global assessments since 2016 up to 2020. And why do we care that biodiversity is being lost? Well, because biodiversity supports all systems of life on the planet. This is the beginning of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the latest document adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2022. And it explains very well, I think it illustrates the importance of biodiversity. It provides us with food, medicine, energy, clean air and water, security from natural disasters, as well as recreation and cultural inspiration. So it's fundamental to the planet and to human well-being. And passing on the interface between biodiversity and science and technology, you may be well aware that there are multiple facets on this interface. First of all, of course, we need scientific evidence of environmental degradation to push for policy action. So scientific knowledge can be an incentive for policy action. There are also technological solutions to environmental challenges. But again, importantly for this presentation, biodiversity is the source material for biotechnological innovation. As we saw before, it's used for medicine, for food, for new agricultural varieties, for cosmetics, for many things. At the same time, biotechnological innovation is also a source of risk, both for human health, as well as the environment and biodiversity. And the main forum that has been discussing the interface between biodiversity and biotechnology is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, one of the three Rio Conventions adopted in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, alongside the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and the UN Climate Change Convention. Currently, almost universal application, currently has 196 parties. The notable exception, the United States of America. It has three objectives: conservation, sustainable use of biological diversity, and what differentiates it from the previous environmental conventions, its third objective, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. It is because of this objective, as well as other far-reaching provisions on technology transfer and on financial resources, that the Convention on Biological Diversity was considered to be a victory for the Global South. Okay, it is a far-reaching convention in general. Its ambition, let's say, the state parties organize their ambition through 10-year-long strategic documents. The latest one being the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, that I opened the presentation with, okay, that we saw the introduction. And you see in the photos, the signing ceremony with Fidel Castro. And the second picture is Gro Harlem Brundtland, Norway's prime minister, that you might know her as the president of the commission that authored Our Common Future, the report that kickstarted the explosion of multilateral environmental agreements in the 90s. Just to show how far-reaching the convention is, you see like a list of what they've been dealing with, a whole lot of thematic work programs, as well as cross-cutting issues, just to show why we call the CBD an umbrella convention. It covers everything, which is also part of the reason why its implementation is so difficult. And to pass more specifically on biotechnologies, in 2000, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety was adopted under the convention. Currently has 173 state parties. After many years of negotiation, it was adopted it regulates the safe transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms, which is the term used under the protocol for genetically modified organisms, GMOs, that may have adverse effects on biodiversity. So basically, the Biosafety protocol operationalizes the precautionary approach by regulating the transboundary movement of genetically or living modified organisms and setting up an advance informed agreement procedure that allows parties to the protocol to decide whether they want those GMOs or LMOs to enter their territory or not. It also establishes rules for risk assessment and risk management. It sets several kinds of rules. We cannot get into detail. Also on biosafety, in 2010, the supplementary protocol on liability and redress was adopted, which sets up rules and procedures in the field of liability and redress relating to damage resulting from living modified organisms on biodiversity. I mean, again, we're not going to get into detail, just to point out that it's important because it's one of the very few international instruments on liability and redress that is for environmental damage that is currently into force. And finally, the third, legally binding protocol, right? So all these are legally binding protocols adopted under the convention. The Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing that has the objective of operationalizes the third CBD objective on fair and equitable benefit sharing towards the providers and stewards of genetic resources and traditional knowledge by setting more detailed rules exactly on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing through a bilateral system of exchanges. It's so the Nagoya Protocol establishes rules providing that access to genetic resources is based on the provider country's prior informed consent, and also sets the obligation to establish mutually agreed terms, which is basically a private contract between the provider country of genetic resources and traditional knowledge and the user country. So the country, and the users, so the institute or the company who wants access to these genetic resources for research and development purposes. I mean, we're going to discuss further down more in detail the whole system of access and benefit sharing and its rationale. So, in a nutshell, this is the system under the CBD. From one side, the Nagoya Protocol on ABS, access and benefit sharing, we use the acronym ABS, which aims to address, let's say, the socioeconomic risk, because its objective is to reduce the inequity in the research and development landscape and provide funds for the provider countries, which are generally developing countries from the global south, to achieve their sustainable development and conservation objectives. And on the other side, the biosafety side, which aims to address the environmental risk, usually linked to genetically or living modified organisms. And to put all this in the context of bio-based research and development or bio-based innovation, and again, to make clear that when we talk about bio-based innovation, we talk about all kinds of pharmaceuticals, agricultural or cosmetic industries, we see that there is a whole complex of instruments that get into place, from basic and applied research, that all the instruments that regulate access to genetic resources fall into place, up to the very end, when we talk about international trade. Then, of course, WTO instruments would fall into place, as well as biosafety instruments. And this shows already that it's not only the CBD that is applied or is to be applied in bio-based innovation, but it is a whole spectrum of instruments, often with competing objectives that come into operation. And I tried to illustrate this complexity with this diagram. And I did not even manage to include everything in here. So what you see in red, the law of the sea, finance and development aspects are not even included, but we see a very dense regulatory and institutional landscape when it comes to the environment, agriculture, trade, human rights, and culture. Okay. So this was explained in literature as part of the regime complex. Raustiala and Victor in 2004 came up with this idea to explain this dense institutional and regulatory landscape, which emerged as a result of the increase to the value of genetic resources, which was again linked to biotechnological innovation. So the scheme is that biotechnological developments resulted in change in value of genetic resources, and that change in value drove the emergence of property rights, first intellectual property rights, and then rights linked to national sovereignty under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so technological change, this line of biotechnological developments led to a normative shift from the principle of common heritage of humankind that was applied in the case of genetic resources up to the 90s. We passed to intellectual property rights, and then again to the principle of national sovereignty, and thus national rights over genetic resources under the CBD and other related conventions. So we see that technological developments led to this dense activity of international lawmaking and institution building, with institutions often having different and often even conflicting mandates. This, according to Raustiala and Victor, led to path dependency and to what they call strategic consistency, meaning that negotiators or state parties often choose, intentionally leave inconsistent certain levels of decision-making so that to be able to move according to the interests between different policy fora. The question of the relationship between the CBD and intellectual property rights fora is an example of this inconsistency and the links between intellectual property rights and benefit sharing objectives, with negotiations still going on in different forms and countries being unable to reconcile exactly the two. Lawyers do not like inconsistency a lot. So in the International Law Commission in 2006 came up with a report on the fragmentation of international law. So all this is also evidence of ongoing fragmentation trends. And then scholarship started discussing different mechanisms and tools for regime interaction, how to ensure consistency between the different fora. Now, recent technological developments further increase this complexity. So in the field of access and benefit sharing, there is a whole suite of technological developments linked with what we call in the policy fora digital sequence information, which is a term that refers to the information content of genetic resources. So thanks to developments in bioinformatics, researchers are now able to take the information content and be able to replicate it without having access to the physical sample of genetic resources. And they can exchange it now as an email. On the other side, when it comes to biosafety, there is a whole suite of novel biotechnologies, including gene editing, engineered gene drives, and synthetic biology that challenge the current biosafety instruments. Okay, I'm going to start from the access and benefit sharing side and explain a bit more the rationale behind it. So as I mentioned, most genetic diversity evolved in the global south, what we now call developing countries. I mean, due to colonization, most of this diversity and genetic resources resulted in institutions in the global north, okay, and in gene banks, in botanic gardens, everywhere. Due to the unequal capacities to use and take advantage of these genetic resources, the initial providers of biodiversity, meaning the developing countries in the global south, and the communities, mainly indigenous peoples, that conserved this biodiversity, these genetic resources, cannot use and take advantage of their richness. Then, at some point, the application of intellectual property rights resulted in broad privatization of the genetic resources, or more accurately, the modern varieties that resulted from these genetic resources that previously were considered as public goods. Access and benefit sharing came along following the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity and later its Nagoya Protocol, aiming to redistribute parts of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. However, they largely fail, despite very sophisticated access and benefit sharing frameworks under the Convention and its protocols and other related ABS treaties. Benefits have not flown back to the stewards and providers of genetic diversity, mainly, again, because of conflicts with intellectual property rights and the trade policy structure. Now, we have a second wave of technological developments related to digital sequence information. Again, there is a struggle between developed and developing countries regarding exactly sharing benefits back to the original stewards of genetic resources in the global south. The access and benefit sharing frameworks are generally considered inappropriate to regulate the digital form of genetic resources, so we need new benefit sharing arrangements to close the gap, according to the developing countries. Okay, this is the very simplified scheme. And to zoom in more specifically in the regime complex when it comes to access and benefit sharing, we see that despite its failure, and there is empirical data about this failure, that access and benefit sharing agreements do not work. They are not successful in bringing benefits back to the original stewards. The access and benefit sharing concept keeps multiplying within the environmental realm, but also outside. So from the CBDH in Nagoya Protocol and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which is, a treaty specifically for the agricultural realm, it has gone to the 2023 agreement under the Law of the Sea on Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, and also to the World Health Organization, both in the pandemic influenza preparedness framework and the current negotiations for a treaty on pandemics. So somehow, even though it is not successful, the ABS concept has become the go-to mechanism for international negotiators to bring some kind of equity that is admittedly lacking in bio-based innovation. Okay. I'm not going to get into detail. There are several challenges. There is lack of clarity on terminology. Even the term digital sequence information is not an agreed term. For instance, in the World Health Organization, they use the term genetic sequence data to refer to the same concept, more or less. There are open questions when it comes to linkages with patentability of digital sequence information, because as you might know, patent law, there is not like a universal, like a global treaty on patent law. It's mostly upon national jurisdictions. And there is again a whole struggle between developed and developing countries as to what benefits should be served and how. Okay, there are also many practical issues with regard to the traceability. How do we track like the digital content, which can circulate via an email. So the CBD tried to resolve this by establishing a multilateral mechanism on digital sequence, on benefit sharing from digital sequence information. But they also have to deal now with a vertical, let's say, expansion of making the regime complex even more complicated. We have new actors coming into the game. In this case, it's the International Nucleotide Sequence Database Collaboration, which has actually been around since the 70s, but in a totally different realm than environmental treaties. It is a collaboration between national databases, mainly of Japan, EU, and the US. So again, we're talking about developed country databases that has been quite successful in putting in the public domain genetic sequence data or digital sequence information by requiring all researchers from the life sciences to publish the genetic data that they research about. So there is a huge database of this kind of data since the 70s, without interlinkages with the access and benefit sharing developments in the environmental policy realm, that now developing countries are afraid that might be misused or even patented, then in disregard of the benefit sharing, of the rights to benefit sharing. And so trying to bypass all these complexities, the CBD managed to establish in 2022 a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. So we are moving far from the bilateral approach of the Nagoya Protocol between provider and user, and we're establishing a multilateral mechanism. So we are not trying to control access, but we try to reap the benefits and share them according to a list of criteria. Okay, I mean, the establishment in 2022 was considered a big victory. It had great symbolic and political value. In legal terms, in the decision, there were more questions than answers. Most of the issues remained unsettled. This was partly corrected in 2020 to 2024 in the CBD conference of the parties that finished like 3 weeks ago, when state parties managed to adopt a decision on the modalities of this multilateral mechanism. I have copied some bits and pieces of the decision. So the approach that we are going for is a horizontal approach where all companies in sectors that rely on digital sequence information, so we assume that the agricultural and the pharmaceutical sector are using digital sequence information, and we require contributions. And these contributions are going to be shared according to criteria. There are indicative rates, okay, 1% of the profits or 0.1% of revenue for these companies, which are about to contribute according to their size. There is a list of requirements for entities operating databases that share publicly digital sequence information. And there is a series of requirements for parties, what to do with that have databases in their territories, and for non-parties, mainly the United States, okay? Contributions can be made directly. And then there are certain criteria how we are going to share these contributions, how they are going to be dispersed. Importantly, half of the funding that reaches this fund is supposed to go back to support indigenous peoples and local communities that have been stewarding biodiversity and genetic resources, right? So, some remarks on this recent decision. I mean, on top of this surprisingly horizontal tax-like approach, let's say, to benefit sharing, which is again a shift, it could signify a shift in policy making and the surprising reach to non-parties, which is also kind of realistic, right? Because somehow the US is not a party, but somehow it needs to be brought in because we need contributions from companies and databases based in the US. At the same time, we have no clue what kind of funding this mechanism will come up with, because there are several layers of uncertainty in implementation. First of all, as all decisions of the CBD, including the legally binding protocols, but even more the non-binding decisions of the Conference of the Parties, implementation relies on national legislation and policies. Okay, this is a non-binding COP decision. We saw before the legal language is weak, even for a non-binding instrument. So parties are invited and others are encouraged. And there is no use of shall that signifies a mandatory legal requirement. It's should. It's all more like, an incentive towards an incentive rather than requirement approach. Then again, the rates are indicative. So parties may establish their own rates if they do so. And the list of sectors are also indicative. Okay, so there are again, several layers of uncertainty. And there was this Guardian article during the meeting of the Conference of the Parties that there is going to be pushback. Okay, already AstraZeneca, like a British, Swedish, like mega company, threatened apparently the UK government during the meeting of the parties not to agree to this decision. All these challenges are going to be put forward during implementation. Okay, and now what are we doing with the digital sequence information? Okay, where is it used? In what kind? And this is the digital sequence information is the raw data, the raw material that is used in this whole suite of novel biotechnologies. And I just put here a series of terms, like to be able to understand what we're talking about. And so CRISPR gene editing, you might be familiar with it. It's a new tool for gene editing that allows us to intervene to the genome of living organisms without introducing foreign genetic material, but intervening to the genetic material of the same organism. One of its main applications of the CRISPR gene editing technique is the engineered gene drives. Engineered gene drives is a form of in situ of population intervention on the population basis. So it's a form of biased inheritance. What we do is we drive the gene. We select which gene passes to the following generation or not. One of the main applications is the engineered gene drive mosquitoes. And there are experiments with this form of mosquitoes as a way to combat malaria. So through gene drive mosquitoes, the aim is to make it possible only the birth of male mosquitoes, so that the female mosquitoes that transfer malaria are not born, and eventually the population dies. Okay, then there are experiments going on, like also outside, and it's being considered as a legitimate form of malaria control. And finally, synthetic biology is a general term that covers a whole suite of new biotechnologies that have that look at biology through engineering eyes, let's say. So through like resettling bits and pieces of an organism. And like several Nobel Prizes already on different of these novel biotechnologies. First, Francis Arnold in 2018 for the directed evolution of enzymes, which is a form of protein design. In 2020, Charpentier-Doudna famously got a Nobel Prize in chemistry for CRISPR gene editing for the tool. And then again, in 2024, David Baker for computational protein design, all tools related to synthetic biology, okay? There is a whole a big list of promises and risks. Many of them are very much in parallel with the initial promises and risks of genetic engineering for like more traditional genetically modified organisms of the 90s. There are some new ones. For instance, what I talked about, the disease vector control is a new one for GM mosquitoes. There are some promises with regard to biodiversity conservation, even when it comes to de-extinction. So there are some scientific projects worldwide that promise to bring back species that have been lost. On the other hand, I mean, all these developments come against a history of overpromising and under-delivery when it comes to genetic engineering. At this stage, there is the new promise in the context of climate change. There is the new promise that synthetic biology is going to give us tools to fight or adapt or mitigate climate change. Finally, there are more serious security considerations for dual use. And I mean, it's worth saying that it's the Biological Weapons Convention that first started work on synthetic biology, like even before the multilateral environmental agreements. And you see here just some headlines, what synthetic biology promises. It promises like everything. It promises to change our world, to address major challenges from climate change to pandemic preparedness. It promises sustainability. It promises money. On the other side, okay, I mean, there are serious socioeconomic risks. I mean, they have been substantiated in the Technology and Innovation Report of 2021 by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, with a particular focus on gene editing, which focused particularly on the size of the gene editing market, the focus particularly in developed countries, so like a huge lack of diversity when it comes to the development. At the same time, the landscape of intellectual property rights is, according to scholarship, is like perfect storm because it combines the challenges of biotechnology and software. And this is illustrated by a high-profile patent dispute in the United States going on for more than 10 years now, having Sarpet Dutna, the Nobel laureates, fighting with Feng Zhang of the Broad Institute and their institutions, like litigation costing like millions, over a patent that attempts to cover all the CRISPR applications on eukaryotic genomes, which would cover all pharmaceuticals for humans, this patent. And as the UNCTAD report noticed, it brings new waves of inequality, that they notice specifically that each wave of technological change brings about new shapes of inequality. And this comes on top of an extremely concentrated seed industry structure globally, that following the 2015-2016 wave of mergers and acquisitions, these slides are from a recent FAO meetings like 2 or 3 months ago, that we were shown how 3 major companies control more than 70% of the commercial landscape for seeds, the commercial market for seeds, with whatever consequences this involves for global food security. And half of their portfolio is genetically modified seeds, even though genetically modified seeds are cultivated only in 30 countries globally. Now, to pass on the environmental risk and trying to connect socioeconomic and environmental risk. Okay, I think the major illustration of these new risks are genetically modified mosquitoes. And there are experiments, like there have been certain experiments in Africa also in the US, in California and Florida, living genetically engineered mosquitoes. And there have been studies, there have been some scandals, let's say, on the news, how the US military has been the top funder of gene drives, and how the Gates Foundation has been pushing for application of gene-drive mosquitoes in an attempt to beat malaria. Actually, Florian Rabits from the University of Kaunas in Lithuania did a quite detailed network analysis of the organizational structure, both the research collaborations and funding when it comes to gene-drive research. And he came to the result that an overwhelming share of global research funding passes from the Gates Foundation to Imperial College London. So extreme lack of diversity when it comes to research and funding. And also from the US National Institute of Health to a couple of US universities. And now where the CBD gets into that, I mean, as we said, the CBD has quite a long history, okay, of regulating biotechnology and the interface between biodiversity and biotechnology. I mean, importantly, with two legally binding protocols, okay, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety and the liability protocol. Now, in the recent years, we see a shift towards moving away from regulation of risks and toward the sharing of benefits of biotechnologies. And we see more and more limitations in agenda setting, which may reflect changes in country positions, as well as global changes in the biotechnology industry. I mean, for instance, like the US-based Monsanto is now owned by the German Bayer, and companies of this size certainly impact national positions. And again, we see more focus on the economic promise rather than the risks of biotechnology. And as illustrations, the biosafety target, let's say target 17 that I have there of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is not really a target. I mean, there is not a year, or there is no we're not declaring that we do something by some time. It's rather a repetition of what's in the convention already, with again focus on the benefits. From the recent decisions of the recently finished meeting of the Conference of the Parties, we see an excerpt from the decision on synthetic biology. Every one of these paragraphs was negotiated word by word, and we see how they focus particularly on the benefits and on the positive impacts of synthetic biology. Only the third one refers to the potential negative impacts of synthetic biology. When it comes to voluntary guidance, the Conference of the Parties did welcome the additional voluntary guidance materials when it comes to engineered gene drives. It's a technical document of 88 pages. We might want to consider if this will have any impact to decision makers and how. And to go back to the regime complex, at the same time, the World Health Organization is working on genetically modified mosquitoes from a different mandate, from a different point of view, focusing more on public health. And the World Health Organization has declared in its position statement that it does not rule out any kind of instrument or tool in an effort to combat malaria, including GM mosquitoes. And there is also another technical document out in 2022, the guidance framework for testing GM mosquitoes. So there is clearly a push towards actual, testing them on the ground, outside. And now some of the underlying challenges, what there is no discussion on in these policy fora. There is definitely a discussion on the inequalities, the capabilities to use, and more developing countries are bringing up more and more. There is not so much discussion when it comes to the responsiveness of the outcomes of scientific progress and what each society wants to receive or not. There is no discussion on the pathways of scientific progress. Okay, there is rather, I mean, to go back to the Raustiala framework of and impacts of regime complexity, there is rather a path dependency towards bioeconomy and biorevolution, towards using as much as possible synthetic biology. We see the structural inequality between countries and stakeholders, but also structural inequalities between the knowledges and development pathways. And this, of course, links to the colonial history of collection and use of genetic resources, which is expanded by technological innovation. And this is partly what we started addressing with Christine Frison, a colleague and principal investigator of the ERC project in Liège, in the book chapter that I mentioned there, and we will be addressing much more during this ERC project that just started. And the legal scholarship cannot propose much. I mean, I think there is definitely a space for interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary exploration of these issues, and particularly going into the science and technology studies scholarship. For instance, Marina Montenegro David, a colleague from Berkeley, she has come up with this tool, with this concept of technology sovereignty, borrowing from the concept of food sovereignty to propose tools that could be used for a more localized control of technology, of technological development. As well as Chidi Ogoamanam, I think he's from McGill in Montreal, that he came up with the concept of indigenous data sovereignty to bring back to the original stewards of biodiversity control over the information that comes from the genetic resources. And I'm going to conclude with a list of questions rather than conclusions. I mean, I think there is, starting from the regime complexity theory, I think there are indications of path dependence towards this, what we call biorevolution and bioeconomy, towards this extreme dependency on high resource technological advancement that is particularly focused on the needs and comes from the developed world. And also I see this complete separation between access and benefit sharing on the one hand and biosafety on the other hand, which result in a complete separation between the socioeconomic and the environmental risk in scholarship, but also in policy practice, which should be bridged. And then there are a couple of, there is a series of questions. I think that we have been dealing with them since, I don't know, the 90s at least. What is the role of law and regulation in governing scientific and technological transition? How to regulate in the face of deep scientific uncertainty? And how to ensure fair distribution of risks and benefits, both globally, but also within its society separately. And then there are also like a series of more philosophical, let's say, questions. How do the futures of science and technology take shape? Who decides? Whose knowledge matters? And how can we promote, as scholars, how can we promote consideration of alternative? How to open up alternative technological pathways and political futures? And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much. I know it was very technical. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tsioumani. I have lots of questions about Jurassic Park type scenarios that are flowing through my head. So this is very, very complex stuff. Let me open the floor to questions from the audience straight away, however. And Yeah, I'm just going to fly over there with the roving microphone so that people online can also hear.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting um, overview. I wanted to know, I'll try to word it as easy as possible, how much weight security issues of dual uses have in the slowdown of research progress, because we have seen that there are like several challenges, socioeconomics of all types. And I wanted to know, like, is it just a small part of the challenges, or does it play a big part? Especially, I was thinking about the US, the UK, or maybe the Western world, and their like anxiety of the knowledge spreading to rogue states or terrorism. So I was wondering if there is a big part that is preventing us to use biotechnology more, or if it's just a small contribution of among the others.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, Elsa. I was wondering, at first you were showing the protocols and you were saying that the one on liability and redress is the only one on this topic that is currently in our scenario. And I noticed that it has like a third of parties compared to all of the others protocols. And I was wondering how this plays a role, if it has any effect on the wider framework. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? First round? Then I'll give you the floor while I check online.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. So on the dual use, I mean, I must first say that I'm not an expert, okay, because I'm not dealing with security considerations. As far as I know, there is serious consideration in the Biological Weapons Convention. There is a working group dealing with this kind of like dual use questions on synthetic biology. And it was before the environmental treaties started dealing with the topic. But I would not say that dual use consideration stop different actors of using synthetic biology tools. And for instance, the synthetic biology community, let's say, it's a very spread community, and it's a very widespread community, and it includes several unofficial actors that range from high school students, for instance, and the so-called biohackers or biopunks that do SynBio applications at their homes. It's actually quite easy to buy toolkits online to experiment. And apart from university students, etc., there is an international genetically engineered machine competition, it's called, that it takes place annually. It's at the core of this synthetic biology community. And let's say, like generations of new researchers are being trained through this competition. I actually spoke with a couple, as part of the Marie Curie research, I interviewed some of them, and really there is, the whole iGEM competition is being self-regulated, let's say. It's surprisingly open and widespread, and lacking official regulation. I mean, taking into consideration what they are doing. So I would say that no. I mean, I don't know if there are some kind of SynBio experiments at another level that are being kept secret, or, but yeah, I guess we will never know about them. And on the liability and redress protocol, yes, there are definitely less parties. It's also a quite narrow Protocol. It basically establishes the obligation for parties it basically has obliges parties to establish response measures in the case of damage to biodiversity resulting from living modified organisms based on administrative measures. So it's not an international liability scheme. Yes, and there hasn't been an accident, how to put it, a very big event so far to see its application in practice. But I think it follows the line of a difficulty in international environmental law to establish liability instruments for international environmental damage. Yeah.
Then I'll take a quick opportunity. Sorry, Elsa. So I'm slightly unfair because I know your project quite well. So I wondered if you could say something more to some of those interdisciplinary points that you mentioned. So in particular, I'm thinking about what we can take from science and technology studies about how to deal with massive complexity and massive uncertainty. So maybe some of the approaches of risk society or Beck, those kinds of strains of thinking and how they might bring some potential solutions here. But then also how all of this matches up with the capacities that we currently have in multilateral environmental negotiations. So Elsa and I were at the COP recently, and sitting in those rooms and seeing how politics is done at that level is you worry, because you see people arguing for 3 hours over one line which has perhaps not that much impact on the real complexity and the real difficulties and opportunities, but also inequalities that you've been talking about coming out of this regime. So I guess my broader question is, can multilateralism in the crisis it's in today, is there hope that it can deal with this kind of complexity and uncertainty and the speed at which it moves? Easy question. Anybody else?
Thank you, Luisa. I must say the short answer is no, but on the other hand, it's the only tool we currently have. And I must say I'm an unapologetic supporter of multilateralism, despite the challenges and the difficulties and the horror we've been saying, like particularly recently, like from all possible angles. I mean, this, yeah, the only tool. And what does the UN do? Not much. I mean, on the other hand, what is the UN? I mean, it only provides the table for like people, for governments and actors to talk to each other. It's definitely the lowest common denominator. But again, it's the only form of collaboration that we can establish. And I mean, I don't want to be like completely pessimistic, but I mean, over the 25 years that I've been following these processes, I've seen them going downwards, and from starting from the quality of text and the quality of lawmaking, and we see and also as an international lawyer, okay, we end up with decisions that are hard to read, let alone translate into other languages. I mean, and I try to imagine like a negotiator bringing those decisions back home and trying to convince in all good faith, okay, the lawmakers to actually implement them. And many of them really do not make sense. I mean, because like it's like in this game of negotiations that they end up each introducing their favorite word here and there, or preferably everywhere. So we end up with super long decisions that make very little sense, even in English or in the 6 UN languages that they are adopted. And we had just quantity rather than quality of text. And we see the language of the CBD, okay, in 1992, which was a legally binding convention. And I see the language, some of very unqualified requirements, provisions in the convention that have been diluted as the years pass by to decisions that make very little sense. And I think that now the very unqualified commitments in the CBD concerning, for instance, the financial resources, like the obligations of developed countries or the technology transfer or benefit sharing, etc., they could not be agreed now. They were agreed in 1992 for a variety of reasons, but now there is a struggle even to refer to the same party's own commitments, let alone implement them. So, how exactly to move forward? I don't know. And that's why, we rely now on STS and try to come up with new ways, like new tools, how to open up new pathways in science and technology, but also in law and policy making. Yes, the one we have clearly do not work. But as I said, I think it's the best we have.
Thank you very much, Elsa. I was thinking of the specific position of indigenous peoples, and you mentioned the failure of benefit sharing mechanisms, and it made me think of them being the object of protection, but also them being put at risk by international law. So international law gives and takes through patents and gives through human rights protection. But then I was simply wondering whether, based on your experience and knowledge of cases, there is a genuine interest of them in benefit sharing, and whether there are cases in which they were genuinely interested in benefit sharing, or whether it is just funny rhetoric for Western public opinion to know that there are mechanisms for benefit sharing. You mentioned also that despite the failure, benefit sharing clauses are being reintroduced in instruments. So I wanted to ask you whether, based on your knowledge, there are cases of genuine interest in benefit sharing.
Yes, thank you. This is a very interesting question. This is actually a very interesting case study, and with Luisa, we work a lot on the position of indigenous peoples in these processes. As you said, they are in a very weird position because, often they feel defeated by national law in their own countries, and they try to come up with other legal tools to fight for their rights, okay? And in many cases, international law is seen as one such tool. So I think we are in the very weird position that they have been frustrated with national law tools, at least in many cases. They turn to international law and they try to reap those advantages. They haven't been frustrated yet. So many of them are really participating with very good faith in these processes, and they really want to reap whatever benefits they can, like at the international policy level. Now, when it comes to specific benefit sharing agreements, there is, of course, a diversity of practices. Because, of course, indigenous peoples, we're talking about the huge diversity globally. Not one community is the same as the other. And there have been, there is empirical data, there have been cases that show that benefit sharing may create frictions between communities. For instance, it's very rare that only one community has access to genetic resource. Let's say a corn variety that, this is an actual case, a corn variety in Mexico that has nitrogen fixing qualities the soil. And there was an American company that wanted to have access to this corn to breed other varieties, and they wanted to do it legally according to the terms of the CBD. So they approached the Mexican ministry. Then the Mexican ministry sent them to the community. They approached the community. They signed a benefit sharing agreement. We do not have access to that benefit sharing agreement because it was confidential. So that's another issue. How exactly do we assess if benefit sharing is fair and equitable if we do not have access to the actual benefit sharing agreement? Anyway, what one community agrees, signs with a company for whatever benefits they are getting, like, I don't know, like 1.5% of the royalties of the new variety, a new school, like electricity for the village, like you name it. It could be whatever benefits they decide to be, they agree upon. The next community that has access to that has been cultivating the same corn variety for years and years does not want to sell it to the company. And then, of course, the second community falls behind because one, the company gets the corn, and B, the second community does not get the benefits. It's like yeah, because it's a market mechanism at the end of the day, benefit sharing. That's why communities now ask for broader tools. That's why we talk about like we talk about agroecology, for instance, other kinds of development.
I think everybody's brains are about to explode with the amount of information. So maybe we can just thank Dr. Tsioumani for her really fascinating but really tricky lecture.